Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. You can tell this is obviously quite the event by the packed house that we have this morning. I'm delighted to be hosting Richard Tice. Thank you so much for giving up your time to come and join us. I know how busy you are and how many other events and obviously time in Parliament, etc. So we're really grateful that you are spending some time with us this morning. For anyone who doesn't know us, I'm Charlie Pickles, I'm director here at Restate Think Tank. I will just give you our tagline, which I think summarises what we're about. So our tagline is bold ideas to remake the state. So it feels like the perfect framing of a conversation with Reform UK. You obviously have been incredibly clear that you think that Britain is broken, and what is a fantastic tagline that Britain needs reform. So we will get into what that looks like. I will spend the first sort of half of this time having the privilege of being in conversation with Richard, and then I will make sure I allow plenty of time for everyone in the room to ask any questions you may have. Again, given our focus is very much the state, public services, machinery of government, all of that side of things, I will focus my time on reform's vision for the state and how that will change. I'm sure there will be people in the audience who also want to pick up things like the economy and growth, and I know, Richard, you've been doing a huge amount on that for the party, so if you have questions on that side of things, please do still ask when we get to that. Very tiny bit of framing. Sort of doesn't need to be said because it's now so commonly understood, but obviously Reform UK have come from almost a standing start and just within a few years are consistently now topping the polls by some way. I mean, it's not a close fight at the moment. I think the latest poll puts you on 27% and Labour are second at something like 19%. I think you're also catching up in terms of membership with Labour, which at the moment is the political party that has the largest number of members, and you've gone past everyone else and are rapidly getting to that point. So clearly, preparing for government and seeing yourselves as a very realistic proposition to be forming our next national government is absolutely the right thing to be doing, and we'll get into some of that. And I think it is just worth reminding ourselves why, I think, one of the reasons why Reform UK is proving so popular amongst the population, and that is because the population are deeply, deeply frustrated with how the state operates. And just to take one poll, but in one, 77% of Britons reported agreeing with you that Britain is broken. And another 87% of Britons say they have no or very little trust now in politicians. So clearly, the appetite for something that is quite radically different to what we have now is very much at the forefront of the public's minds, and that, I think, is, and we'll come on to perhaps some of the shifting in Reform's position over the last few months, but I think that is the proposition you are offering, that we need to radically reimagine what the state looks like and how it functions. So I'm going to start with a very broad question, if I may, which is that if indeed Britain is broken, if indeed public services need a radical rethink, need fixing, need reform, what does the state look like under a Reform government? What does success look like? How will it feel different if a Reform government gets in? Are there some core principles or values that you will be applying to remaking the state?
Yes, good morning everybody, and of course I'm a businessman, I'm not a politician.
I think that should be safe.
I think the core principle is, firstly, there's one umbrella word, which is growth, which we all understand in the world of business and which has completely disappeared from the UK economy. If you look at it, I mean, at best we're flatlining. The private sector, give or take, is in recession. The public sector is sort of propping it up by a sugar rush of borrowing. So growth is the key thing. A smaller state, the waste of taxpayers' cash at every level, whether it's council level that we're seeing, whether it's at the national level, is egregious, it's frankly obscene. And then deregulating, and sort of come on to that in more detail in a moment, but deregulating, those two things. If you focus on cutting wasteful spending and deregulating, which encourages people to say, yeah, it's worth bothering actually taking some risk, getting stuck in, investing money, is the critical factor. And that's always been our approach. We've been misrepresented by our good friends in the press. But when you do those two things, then you can afford what we call sort of performance-related tax cuts. After you've reduced the size of the state, you've got the bond market satisfied, and you deregulate. And the great thing about deregulating is that it actually is, give or take, cost-free to the government, and it stimulates activity. And you know you're in serious trouble when at one of these events recently, an investor from overseas said, we now view the UK as a quaint place to go on holiday, but completely uninvestable. And that's where we're at, folks, and we should be under no illusions about that whatsoever. And when some of our own big FTSE 100 businesses, some of the biggest, when they decide to invest hundreds of millions of pounds in a new manufacturing facility elsewhere, as opposed to here, because it's too difficult, because of the regulations primarily, you know we've got problems. So a smaller, smarter state with smart, safe regulations, not what I call daft, dither and delay. And if we achieve that, and putting, you know, let's be really businesslike about it. Actually, the purpose of the government is to look after its customer, and its customer is the British citizens who pay taxes. And that's the thrust of it.
And I want to come back to what deregulation looks like in practice, and it's something we've got a big programme here at Restate on regulation and regulators, so we're very interested in that side of things. But I just want to come back to that point about the public services and how we fix the public services. And you know, we spend, what is it, over £1 trillion every year now on the state. You actually wrote a paper for us many, many years ago when we were indeed reform.
How prescient was that?
Precisely. Which I believe you had a co-author on, which perhaps you could tell us in a second who that is, but it was on academies, and one of the core principles in that paper was your argument that actually setting those running parts of the public service free to make decisions about how they want to run, in this instance, their schools, can lead to the sort of innovation which leads to better outcomes. And that could be, and I think you talked about in the report you did for us, that could be allowing flexibility around pay, for example, on teachers.
Yep.
How far, do tell us who the co-author is, because I'm sure that will also amuse the audience as much as when we...
But it was, so that was back in...
Is that a principle, though, that you would want to see?
So that was back in 2008. I was chair of the 15th Academy to be set up, and that was quite an experience, trying to turn around a failing secondary school, where essentially the state was saying, look, we'll provide the finance and the asset, but we need people from the charity sector, the private sector, to come in and run it and manage it. And I was sort of sharing that experience. And it was very helpful to have a co-author who sort of was able to write things, who was on her own interesting journey from being a Lib Dem to being a Conservative at the time, by the name of Liz Truss. And it was my first experience with the unions, because they were thrilled to receive my report as well. So that was sort of part of the journey. But that was about how you reform the management of failing secondary schools. And that report then ended up on the desk of one Michael Gove, one Dominic Cummings, and one Nick Gibbs, and was part of the thought process towards the free schools and the enhancement of the academies programme.
And is that something that you think should be a principle that runs through public service reform? So you know, there's a school of thought that says we need national approaches and we must set a national curriculum and have national, you know, performance frameworks and national pay systems, and there's a school of thought that might argue that actually having local context and nuance, allowing people running parts of the public service, that could be bits of the health service, it could be schools as you've written about, it could be other parts of public services, that actually slightly setting them free and allowing them to make decisions.
Yeah,
is that something that you think a reformed government
very
would
much
embrace?
so. I repeat the point. Governments can fund things and they can hold strategic national assets. I think most people would generally admit that it's not always the case, so don't go over the top, but very often other people are better at actually managing and operating things than you know, people sort of who are steeped in civil service type council environments. And so it's trying to get horses for courses. As a real estate guy, I'm used to lots of joint ventures. And so when we talked about, for example, British Steel, it's a strategic national asset. And so the state could own it, but you could bring in the best private sector management from around the world. You could have long-term procurement contracts both in and out, so that actually you can create a stable, reliable cash flow, refurbish it. Those are the sort of different ways of doing things that hasn't been properly looked at before, and I just think you've got to adopt a really business-like approach to it. That steel, it's strategic. Some people will disagree and say it's not. That's fine. You think you can buy steel on a sunny day. What happens when it's not a sunny day? And we forget, in COVID, we nearly ran out of paracetamol because we always pursued lowest cost. And sometimes you've just got to think strategically. So whether it's that, whether it's other bits, I know people obviously get very excited about healthcare. We haven't put anything specific forward. We just think that sometimes you can get a win-win and focus on the customer. And the customer is essentially the taxpayer.
And is there there is a tension. So how do you resolve the tension? I suppose is the slightly more direct question of wanting to unleash the kind of power of entrepreneurship and private sector and get that growth growing, which ultimately is the only way you can pay for public services if we have a growing economy. I think we can all agree. But also simultaneously being much more state interventionist in an economic model like taking on steel, or there may be other sort of like having, a more interventionist approach to, for example, resilient supply chains. You've mentioned the paracetamols, we had that other things in the pandemic as well where we struggled. And
how manufacturing and the like.
Exactly. So how do you reconcile being potentially quite state sort of interventionist, getting to the and still wanting the kind of...
You're overstating the state. The application of business-like common sense on a situation-by-situation point of view, I think, as opposed to being ideologically purist about it. And I just put a simple point. Where there is big strategic contracts out there, some of the huge contracts, for example, on outsourcing, on the one hand, that's fine, but it's a completely adversarial relationship, where if the state just sort of dumps a whole risk profile on a big outsourcer and doesn't give good information about it, then don't be surprised if the outsourcer applies a huge amount of risk to it, which increases the cost to the taxpayer enormously, and then the taxpayer gets grumpy when the private sector has made a huge fortune. Totally. Whereas if you said, okay, maybe we need a slightly different approach. Should you be a bit more strategic about it? Should you look at a JV approach? Therefore, if you've got a joint venture and you have a good year, well, the taxpayer benefits alongside the private sector. Great. If you have a bad year, you take it on the chin and move on. I just think you've got to be willing to look at that. I'm not saying for everything, of course, but I just think we can be much smarter about it, much more common sense. And that way, if one side gets slightly the better half of the negotiation, it can balance out. And I just think that ultimately the taxpayer can get better value. But fundamentally, everything comes back to growth. If we don't grow, and we think we can keep borrowing 150 billion a year, don't be surprised when we end up with a problem coming soon.
Definitely something that we would argue as well. You mentioned there the kind of smart approaches to, and we would certainly say, and I think there are echoes in what you were just describing around some of the outsourcing, actually through a public procurement lens, and we write a lot about that and how actually there's huge issues in how we do public procurement, and that does lead to waste and failed contracts, and some of that actually is about government being a bad customer, as you were describing, and not designing the right models. But just to think more broadly about the government machine, so we have a whole programme here on reimagining Whitehall. We are strong believers that we need a radical rethink of how the government machine works. We've seen successive governments being deeply frustrated by feeling like they can't get delivery within the things that they're setting out. Now, you've been very clear as a party. You have Danny Kruger now doing the plan for government work. Been very clear that a Reform UK a government would be ready on day one with a plan for delivery. That's the phrase I think that was used. Yet if we think about today, we've got the NAO reporting on the Home Office's failures around data and having no idea how many asylum seekers there actually are, and people not being processed. We're all very, very familiar with, I think, quite the scale of the challenge of getting the civil service to be in a be a high-performing organisation that can deliver for ministers and on ministers' priorities. And how are you thinking about reforming the civil service and the government machine?
So,
things you want to do.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. Look, no one knows when the election will be, but assume that there's a good 2 years. We can use that time constructively. We're setting up working groups across the piece. Some under reform itself, some under a think tank, because we want really good people to contribute. So I gave a speech in Bloomberg 3 weeks ago, and I talked about setting up 4 working groups in the area of financial services. You know, look, and again, complete clean sheet of paper. Thinking again, you know, how's the FCA doing? How's the Prudential Regulatory Authority doing? Is it right the FCA is separate, or should it be under the Bank of England? What's the point of the FCA if they miss big things like, you know, the PPI scandal, the car loan scandal, the Neil Woodford scandal, the gated open-ended real estate fund scandal, I mean, and the LDI scandal? I mean, either do your job or get out of the way and let someone else do your job. So we've got to ask big fundamental questions. You know, pensions and savings, over-complex, underperforming. I've talked a lot about the LGPS, we've got to relook at all of that. Growth capital is another key thing. Too many areas we're losing growing businesses overseas because they can't get the growth capital, and yet the City of London used to be the most important financial centre 25 years ago. It's not. So I'm looking at a whole Big Bang 2, 40 years on from Big Bang 1. Taxation is the 4th one. We're setting up a working group on energy. All of these things, really looking at property. You know, property, everyone talks about the issues around planning. So some will be under reform, some will be under a separate think tank, but let's use this time constructively, ask big picture questions, and you know, just everything needs to be done better. And to do that properly, you've really got to relook at it. And Danny is very focused on that. We all are, essentially. And we've got to use this time constructively. And we've talked about bringing in people with real specialist sector expertise. Some cabinet ministers, some ministers are not likely to have been elected because they'll be specialists in their area. And the government's occasionally done that before. Gordon Brown did a little bit of it. I think we need to look at more of that. Nigel's spoken very strongly about that. Otherwise you end up in a situation where you end up with like 10 or 12 housing ministers in the space of 14 years. Or the same as in rail, and it's, you just get a complete merry-go-round with no expertise.
And then we wonder why we can't reform the system.
Yeah.
I want to ask, so I think the approach to expertise in ministerial roles is really interesting, and as you say, it's been occasionally tried, but very rarely. And it'll be fascinating, perhaps we can come back 2 years into government and sort of reflect on also the party management implications of that and that kind of thing. But I think that's really interesting. One of the other sides, though, of it is that with the best will in the world, the number of ministers is always going to be a very tiny number in a government machine of, you know, I mean, potentially 150,000 less civil servants, but by the pledge that you've made as a party. But still, let's say in a government department, something like the Department of Work and Pensions, you've got thousands and thousands of civil servants. You'll even have more Director Generals and Permanent Secretaries than you will have of ministers. So what about on the official side? Are you know, the speech that Danny gave in launching the Plan for Government Work and you know, that call out to people to come and get involved in the working groups, did reference really wanting to make sure that ministers were in charge of the system and had the capability and capacity to do that. And there was a hint in there that perhaps that might mean ministers appointing the top tier of the civil service. Is that something that we can, I mean, it's something that certainly, you know, think tanks and others have.
Yeah, it's what they do in America. You've got to bring in real expertise and people who've got a track record of making things happen, getting stuff done, and we've got a serious problem. Financially, we are in a serious pickle, folks, a serious pickle. It's much graver than I think many people realise, and you know, there's huge opportunities across the whole piece for the use of AI, whether it's in councils, whether it's in various part of the national public sector, which hopefully people will embrace. But the reality is, public sector productivity is going south, not north. And the results of that is that taxes are going up, productivity is going down, growth is going down, and we can't keep going on like this. So change has to come. And we need to be very clear about that and say to people, if you want change, if you want more growth, if you want more productivity, then that's why you've got to vote reform. And look, some people will embrace that, and some others may say, that's not quite for me. That's the nature of life and progress, I guess. Okay,
so I think we're saying, forgive me for pushing slightly, but I think we're saying you would appoint that top tier of the officials
Yeah, we need to bring in expertise at a variety of levels. You can call them whatever you want by way of titles, we're not being specific like that. We're just saying people need to embrace real expertise, real success. And there's that sort of expression, in America, when you get the call up to go and join the administration, you take a massive pay cut, but it is part of your civic, patriotic duty to your country. And you do that for 3 or 4 years, and then you go back into the private sector. And I think we should embrace that in the UK. Too often, you know what, you're either in your lane, you're in the private sector or in the public sector, and there's not enough crossover.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to use a sort of railway term, we need much more of the junctions crossing over, beautifully oiled and greased so that it works seamlessly.
Lovely, love that image, perfect. And then I wanted to pick up, so obviously we've talked about what a national reform government might do and the change you want to bring. Obviously you are running big parts of the local state already. I think, is it 10 councils?
So we've got majority control in 10
yeah.
and minority in 2, and we're the biggest in the 3rd, which sort of bizarrely we have no say. It's very strange.
Okay.
But there we are. Yes, we are.
And lessons that you're finding at the moment?
It's all going fantastically. We knew it all. We didn't need to do any lessons whatsoever. Look,
but for others to know what those lessons are.
Obviously, we're learning lessons. We always do. I'm 61. I'm still learning. And it's a real fundamental point. You don't stop learning when you leave university. We learn all the way through life, and we need to embrace that. We need to look at training as part of that whole process. Yeah. Across the councils, we're saving hundreds of millions of pounds, renegotiating contracts, saying we're not going to do this property deal, the stuff where I've got stuck in, which I've talked about before, and I'm saying to all the councils, look, I'm a real estate guy, use me. And then when someone phones up and says, should we do this £30 million deal? And I said, not over my dead body. Right, we've saved 30 million quid, and it was so I think there's a learning curve for the council executives as well. There is one issue here, which really is important. Advisors advise, directors decide, or councillors decide, or ministers decide. This idea that civil servants and council executives know best, and that ministers and councillors are cherries on the cake to be patted on the head and told what to do, and that if you ignore their advice, then forget it. That we're done for. And if we need to go to war on that, we will. It's absolutely outrageous.
How do we go to war with that?
Well, I'll come back to that.
When it comes to Westminster.
Come back to that, but I'll tell you what, this is outrageous. People who are elected to office are accountable to the electors. They have to take decisions. So yes, give us the advice, give us the consequences of taking different decisions, but please don't bully elected representatives that if you do something, then you'll lose your indemnity, etc., etc. That is outrageous, and it really winds me up.
And so obviously at a national government level, you can have a ministerial direction, right? So you can have civil servants that say, we don't think this is value for money, all of our analysis shows it's not, but you, minister, if you want to proceed, you'll have that ministerial direction, and that is recorded. In local government, could you give an example of where you feel you've been thwarted on something by the executives, and should we have therefore some equivalent of that national government? Well, no, the elected politicians want to proceed, even if the analysis is showing, because actually, you've got something in a manifesto. Then
I'll give you a live example at the moment, and there's numerous of them. But on the local government pension schemes, right, the actuarial valuers, and I touched on this the other day, they are using a way over prudent discount rate for the actuarial evaluations, despite the fact that 10, 20 and 30 year track records of all of these funds is over 7%. They use a discount rate very often of sub 5, partly because they've recently invested in ridiculous, woke, unlisted, over expensive funds. Feel very strongly about this. And then they're saying, oh no, you can't reduce your employer contributions, and so you've got over-prudence on over-prudence. Oh, and by the way, that suits the vested interest of the assets under management being held higher, etc., etc. This has got to stop, because it's the taxpayer who's being ripped off, and I'm on this big time. So that is a live example where they say, oh no, if you do that, then you can't ignore our advice. Actually, we probably know a hell of a lot more about investment management than some of these people advising, and I feel very strongly about this, and we're going to call it out.
Okay, and then on the local government side of things, obviously, you've talked about saving the millions in not signing certain contracts or kind of renegotiating contracts or thinking differently about property or whatever it might be. But the lion's share of spending in local government is social care, children's services, SEND, and often temporary housing, accommodation, that kind of side of things. But really social care, children's services, SEND. So with the best will in the world, even if you could save even a few, I'm in no way saying that it's not absolutely the right thing to save a few hundred million, but the billions are contained in those, kind of incredibly high demand statutory services. And so how is reform?
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, if you look after the pennies, then the pounds look after themselves. So you shouldn't ignore the odd million here and there. But yes, obviously a lot of it is statutory, but that doesn't just mean you've got to throw more money at it. It doesn't just mean you've got to accept the status quo. You can actually do things for less money and provide a better service. And that's very much the mantra that we talk about and we're aiming. And I just remind people, we're about 14 minutes into a 90-minute football match in terms of running these councils. That's where we're at. So there's a long way to go to achieve success. But take, for example, SEND. I spoke about it the other day, and I said things that people asked me to say that they can't say, purely out of fear and because of the concern about being bullied by certain people. And so fine, I'm big enough, I'm old enough, I can take it on the chin. And I've had fascinating responses. And yes, I upset some folk about the use of one particular word. That's the nature of life. We never stop learning. But the fundamental principle is that everybody accepts in that particular issue that it's not working at the moment. And the tragedy is, it's the children most in need who are losing out the most, not getting better outcomes. And it should be, we're going to talk about this a lot over the coming weeks, months, but it's a really important area. We're digging into it hard. And to those who say we can't do anything or we're not interested in that stuff, you're wrong and you're wrong. It's as simple as that. And we're going to get stuck in, we're going to help, we're going to reform things, change things, and do it better. The beneficiaries will be the children.
And can I ask, because there may be some people in the room who didn't hear your comments previously on SEND, I'm sure not many, but there may be some. So could you describe some of the things you think then might need to be done? Are we talking about, one of the things people have talked about a lot is, I think it was Michael Gove's legislation that was brought in to give parents, basically rights to almost kind of demand whatever service they want in SEND. And if you look at Wales or Scotland, their SEND budgets have not done anything like ours, whereas ours is, is part of it rowing back on that sort of thing? Like how?
Look, sometimes legislation is well intended, but it's the consequences, and it's well intentioned. Though the 2014 Act was, it's gone wrong. Fundamentally, the SEND numbers are increasing somewhere between 8 and 10% a year. We cannot accept that our children are more in need 8 to 10% a year. Just common sense tells you that doesn't feel in your gut right. So something is going on, and there's a whole bunch of stuff around it. So I'm not going to prejudge too much, but we're looking at, we're listening to the experts in the councils, literally who specifically asked me to say some of the stuff I said a couple of weeks ago, because they can't, because they'll be out of a job, they'll be terrified, or they'll be bullied. And I just don't think it's acceptable for people with serious input to be bullied and terrified by serious vested interests, and we're just not going to, I'll take it on the chin. I'm big enough and old enough, on behalf of others who really want some of this stuff addressed.
And then public finances more broadly. So you've touched on various things at the start. You talked about the borrowing levels and how unsustainable that is. If we actually look at the trajectory of our debt, whilst the Chancellor may be able to say that debt will be dropping at the end of her forecast within her fiscal rules, that's only because it goes up and then starts coming down. So actually debt will be higher at the end of the forecast than it is today, and that does feel deeply unsustainable and very much a trajectory to bankruptcy. How will a reform UK government think about the public finances, and will you have fiscal rules?
Well, the fiscal rules they've been using recently, all they do is they state a fiscal rule every year, it goes out 5 years, and a year later they nudge it and tweak it and push it, and you sort of end up losing confidence, which is why the bond markets now apply the moron premium to the state of UK bonds. And I did have to explain to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury in the chamber last week that he had misled the House, you have to say inadvertently, when he said 3 times they were cutting borrowing. I did waive the OBR report and say, you're increasing borrowing over the next 5 years by £504 billion, 60 billion more than was forecast in March. That is not cutting borrowing. You might say you're cutting the deficit as a percentage of GDP. That is a different thing. The lack of understanding about that in this government, right up to the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, is an outrage. They are not cutting borrowing. And the current debt it's approaching 3 trillion. And they think they can just lob another 500 billion, which is half a trillion. And we know that spending is always more and borrowing is always more, and growth is disappointed, and all the growth forecasts were down. So we've got to change that trajectory, and the way to do that is not by more regulation, it's by smart, safe regulation and less regulators, for example, and by cutting the vast amount of wasteful spending. You have to change that trajectory, and then that will kickstart growth again. And the good news is we must remind ourselves, we were really good at this. In the 80s and 90s, we grew every year, give or take, with a couple of exceptions, 2.5% to 3.5% a year. Now, they break out the champagne when they get to 1%.
And therefore, so let's say we do unleash growth, we have smarter regulation, we set the entrepreneurs free, we drive good jobs, good business, tax receipts. That's probably still going to take a little bit of time, right? I mean, you're going to have to get stuff through, the parliamentary timetable in terms of legislation. There's then going to be a slight delay whilst you start getting those benefits. But the public finances are going to stay teetering in that early stage. So I just want to, I suppose, again, slightly prod, and this is unfair because you're absolutely right that we're a long way out of an election, and clearly you're not, you're doing the hard work to decide what you want to do and you're engaging. But just on the fiscal rule point, I think we certainly have argued many times it's a sort of fiction, right? Like this idea of headroom is just, that's just how much you're going to borrow, right? It's not real money, and as you pointed out, if you're having a rolling target, you never have to hit the target. So will reform apply? Got to
relook at the whole thing. There's no point not being prepared to relook at stuff, and suffering a moron premium to your borrowing rate, which currently we've got. So we've just got to be prepared to relook at the whole thing, and that's what the working groups are doing. But fundamentally, just keep it simple, folks. How long can we keep spending more than we're earning and think that ultimately it'll end well? It's a bit like if you keep remortgaging your house, fine when the sun's shining and the value of the property's going up, but when it turns and it starts raining and the property value goes down and you still need to borrow, very quickly you get into negative equity. That's the analogy. And how close are we to that? Well, time will tell.
And then, final question on the public finances, and I've got one other, and I promise I will come to the audience, so get ready with your questions. But a bit like in local government, there are just massive chunks of statutory spending that is actually the lion's share. So we talked about social care, and we talked about SEND, etc. And national government, almost half of all of our spending is on the welfare state. And I mean that by the sense of social security, kind of pensions and health. So the only way to make a huge impact on sustainability of public finances, and if you look at the OBR's projections, I'm sure you've looked at the long-term forecasts, heading for 300% debt to GDP, if we don't change the direction of these things, mind-blowingly stupid not to be trying to address these big drivers of spend. I think Zia Youssef and Lee Anderson did some work on the welfare side, and I think, as said, you've identified about 9 billion a year in savings for disability and sickness benefits, which are going to reach about 100 billion a year. So in terms of that proportion, pensions, I think, remarkably, with great courage, I think Nigel Farage, who hasn't recommitted to the triple lock, you're going to have to go a lot further on these things to get the sort of savings you're thinking about. And is there going to be a plan, that day one plan, for how we actually get the spending on these massive areas down?
Of course. But what we don't know is the state of the finances at the time. We just know they're going to be bad. It's just a question of degree. But Zia and Lee, they've talked about welfare. We will have to go a long way down welfare. Fundamentally, work's a great thing. We have to make work pay, and for too many people at the moment, it doesn't pay. And if you get to the ridiculous situation where you keep upgrading tax-free benefits, but you freeze the income tax threshold starting point, don't be surprised you get to a crossing point where a taxi driver says to me, I only drive 16 hours a week, Gov, because it doesn't pay to drive 40 hours a week. I'll claim back paying for the balance of the week. That's where we've ended up, and it's ridiculous. And across the piece, obviously everybody would like to pay as big a pensions as possible, but you can't guarantee everything if you're worried the country's going bust. You can't afford anything. And when we talk about health spending, I think almost anybody, with a few exceptions, will accept that the health service, always free at the point of delivery, just before anybody gets very excited, is not short of money. And when I say this, I get doctors and nurses message me saying, you're bang on the money. It's just the way it's spent. I just think we can spend less money, smarter, more productively, and get better outcomes, better results. And that's the drive of everything we're doing. Whether it's... we have to ask big picture questions. I've talked about unfunded, open-ended, public sector defined benefit pension schemes. Does anybody, quick question. Who knows the OBR number for the liability of the unfunded pension schemes in the public sector? Any guesses? Hands up. Well, the OBR's current number is about 1.5 trillion. They don't really know. Some people think it could be 2.5 trillion. 20 years ago, it was 750 billion. How long can we keep going on this and not be prepared to discuss it? And it will bankrupt us. It is as simple as that. So.
There's also a fairness argument about.
Yeah, there's a fairness argument,
and 25% into.
And I reiterate, I'm not talking about existing, but I'm talking about the future. And that guarantees I'll get a torrent of abuse before Christmas, which I'll look forward to from various folk. But we have to be. The fundamental question is to everybody: do you want this country to go bust or not? If you don't, we've got to make some big, serious choices.
Absolutely. Final question for me, and then I'm going to open it up to our audience. A bit of a cheeky question, so I hope you'll forgive me. But reform is built on a kind of disruptive sort of, we're going to come in, we're going to shake things up, we're going to be radical, we're going to change things, we're going to do things dramatically differently. And in the last few months, some might say that there has been a slight shift more towards the kind of centre or the mainstream. So, the pledge to get to a personal allowance of 20,000 has become an aspiration because of exactly the context you've described, and, the eminently sensible position to take, that we need to be fiscally prudent on that. In local government, again, unsurprisingly, given all of those costs that we've talked about, some areas are thinking they're going to have to put up council tax rather than lower council tax. The small boats stopping within a couple of weeks is now stopping once we've got the legislation through. Again, completely, what we would expect, right? That's kind of. But these things become much harder the more we look at the detail and the kind of deliverability of things and the challenges, like the sheer scale of the challenge that this government and the next government face. And I wonder how you're thinking about the sort of transition from this real upstart kind of, radical position through to maybe moving slightly more towards the mainstream. I said it was a cheeky question, so...
No, that's fine. So I would put it differently. I don't think it's radical, I think it's common sense. I would just remind people, look, obviously our enemies will misrepresent our position. I would just remind people the very first page of our contract talked about the savings. And it does turn out I've been proven right. Proven right on the Bank of England voluntarily paying interest on reserves. We've had a good meeting with the Governor. He was very happy for it to be debated in Parliament, but the Chancellor rejected that. 20 billion quid a year. Turns out I was right when I said that net zero was costing 30 billion a year. I said that 18 months ago. Everyone said, what are you talking about? A year later, the OBR caught up and said, oh, Tice is right, it's 30 billion a year, give or take. Even the Climate Change Committee. So we've been right about some of these big numbers, big savings. Scrap net zero, that's the sort of number you can save. But it's also right to be ambitious and to set a target and to try and go for it. And if you get a long way towards it, and that's essentially what we're doing. But equally, yes, we just don't know the state of what we're going to find. But there's no one with more business experience, business success, business know-how, who understands what a P&L, a cash flow statement, and a balance sheet is, than the leadership of reform across the piece. And no other political party has got that. And I think that's why we just look at things in a much more business-like way. And just imagine if the country was run in a business-like way, where you run a sort of a lean, mean, profitable machine. Wouldn't that be a good thing? Then, because if you make more profits as a nation, i.e., you grow faster, then you can make choices about where you want to invest it. In more defence, in better healthcare, in better send provision, etc., etc. But as long as you're doing it from a position of profitability as opposed to a position of begging to the bond markets.
Thank you so much, Claire. I've got so many more questions I could ask you. It's been fascinating, and as I say, I'm so grateful that you're spending the time with us. I'm going to open it up for questions. We've got a pretty diverse audience from public and private sector, so I've no idea what you're going to be asked, but hopefully some good questions. I can see I'm going to take a couple of questions. In fact, I'm going to take 3 at once, as I think we're going to have a lot. So, yep, in the middle here, and then gentleman, and there's another gentleman hand there. So, if you can, in the interest of time, I'm going to say, anyone who's been to a Restate event will have heard this before, but please don't give me your life story, give me your question. Tell me who you are and give me your question, and that would be fantastic.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Jennifer Blaney from the UCB Pharma. You've talked a lot about your expertise in wanting to see things in financial services and that being a growth sector, but the other big growth sector in the UK is life sciences. You've talked a lot about policy development with think tanks. I'd just be interested to hear more about how you were going about developing a life sciences policy, given it is a very complex area of growth in the UK.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks. Ed Dominguez from ServiceNow. Just wondered whether your vision of the future state is of a digitally native, AI native state, and talking about comparisons with well-run businesses. Do you envisage the future citizen experience being like the best-in-class digital consumer experiences that most best businesses are moving to?
Thank you. And then finally, yeah.
Hi, I'm Saga. I'm a director at Blakeney Group. My question probably focuses on cost of living and energy. What do you see as the main hurdles in bringing costs down for households with regards to energy bills, and how would you describe your initial thinking on delivering energy security and jobs in the energy sector?
So on energy, it's a very simple answer. We're being misled, we're being lied to. There is a direct relationship between the growth in renewable energy generating capacity and the dramatic growth in electricity prices. And if you scrap net zero, if you promote oil and gas exploration, offshore, onshore, we know it works because it's what drove the significant growth in the 80s and 90s. You cannot be a rich nation without cheap energy, and if we do that, we can get rid of a whole load of these ridiculous taxes, subsidies. I've made it very clear, you can't lie to people and say the bills are going to come down when the renewable industry is asking for 30% higher strike prices and 30% longer contracts in AR7. So we're just putting it out there. That's how you get bills down, and the nonsense that gas prices is an international price, that falls apart when I just remind people the gas price in America is about a third of the UK gas price, right? And when an energy boss tells you that even if the gas price goes to zero, the energy bill is going to stay the same or go higher. So just deals with that. Look, best in class, of course. We absolutely, we should have. Why can't we have best in class public services? Take the best of who does it around the world. For example, if Australia does pensions the best, why can't we take the best of that? If Estonia does digitisation best, why can't we take the best of that? Take the best of AI. Have we got all the answers today? No, but we absolutely should be ambitious, and there are other countries. If we can take the best of the best around the world, we can be best in class, and we should be ambitious towards that. And with regard to the question about life sciences, yes, you're absolutely right. It's vital. I've been meeting with pharma companies. We absolutely will have working groups around all of that. But it's about setting a framework that is attractive. So when big pharma companies say, sorry, I'm going to invest 500 million quid in another country, not in the UK, even though they're listed here, and based here and wants to invest here, you know we've got a problem. And that's around planning, it's around regulation, it's about approvals, it's about the cost of energy, all the related issues. So yeah, we're on it.
Okay, and I'll take another 3. So Dara here. I can't quite see. I can see hands at the back, but not really people. So Zoe, I can see you, and then there's a hand right. Yeah, the back there.
Thank you, Dara Singh from Newton, not the investment bank, as I said earlier. And thank you very much for your contribution so far. Just interested in what your views are about devolution from Whitehall to regions and local areas. There's been a direction of travel over successive governments. Would you want to accelerate that or change that in any way? So any thoughts on that would be helpful.
Okay.
Hello, Zoe from Community Pharmacy England. So preventive healthcare has been a big hot topic for many years. And I think the theory is there in terms of the savings that this can make to the state in terms of reduced hospital admissions, etc. So just wondered what your take on preventative healthcare and that sort of personal responsibility for health versus NHS responsibility is.
Thank you. And then there's a gentleman. Yeah.
Sounds easy to me. Hi, John Nadir from the Centre for Governance of AI. I'm interested in your views on the role of government in enabling AI adoption into the public sector, but also the wider economy.
Thank you so much. Lovely succinct questions. Very much appreciated.
So devolution, in a sense, there's a lot going on at the moment with the changes currently, and that is going to take some time to absorb. You've got new mayoralties, you've got the merging of 2 tiers into 1 tier. That's going to take time. We're going to have to, in theory, it should save a whole load of money. A lot of it comes down to who's organising it, and there are some quite different specifics. In certain areas it works and certain it doesn't. So I think the key thing is, I request the government is don't delay, get on with it. There's nothing worse than dither and delay, because it stops decisions being made. With regard to preventative health, yeah, look, absolutely right. I think AI could be transformational in this space, and personal responsibility, all of that. Equally, I do think that we've got to try and, regulation is so often can just get in the way of this. Things like GDPR, well-intentioned, but I think is probably the most obstructive in healthcare. And I hear this time and time again, from the sharing of data to be able to prevent, to deal with things. So I think that's a big issue that we've got to look at. And then with regard to AI, look, it's also new. We're all learning rapidly, and we'll never stop learning because AI is moving at such a pace. And whether it's private sector, council, government, we just need people to be willing to look at stuff and try it. No one's got the perfect answer, but we must embrace it. And I think we've got to be brave enough. The biggest risk in life is never taking one. And risk is a good thing. Making risk pay is a good thing. And you have to be prepared in the public sector to try things and explain to our customers, we're going to try this, and then we're going to be honest about what's working and what needs tweaking and what didn't work, and we're going to change it and adapt it. I just think that's a much more business-like approach. That I think in the public sector there's too much fear, and so decisions get delayed, nothing happens, and customers, taxpayers get hacked off.
Yeah, and certainly risk aversion is one of the things we talk about so much as a massive barrier to performing.
Smart, I repeat, smart and safe, not daft, dither and delay.
Brilliant. One more set. Yep, James, and then Tim, and then I can see there's a hand in the middle. I can't see who it is, but yeah.
James Hill from The Spectator. Part of today's talk, Richard, is about machinery of government changes. So I just wondered if there's any Whitehall departments that you would break up, abolish, or create.
glad you asked. That was on my list and I didn't get to it. Thank you very much.
Hi, Tim Sarson from KPMG. What are your plans for corporation tax?
Great, and I can't see there was a hand behind. Yeah, there, sorry.
John Clark from Hackler. Does Reform have a sort of principal position on kind of nationalisation of either regulated industries that people see as failing, so for example the water sector, or on services like railways where the government is currently undertaking the railways programme? Is there a kind of principal position that the party has?
Thank you.
So, dealing with departments and things, James, tempting though it is, I'll get in terrible trouble. Terrible trouble if I answer you directly. But I do think maybe what we need is an umbrella of common sense across the whole space. And as a philosophy of thinking, it's a bit like to the councils I say, DOGE is a philosophy of saving money. It's not just a computer cable. So I just put that out there.
Can I ask as a follow-up, just a quick one, the Treasury, is that something you would look at, whether you think the Treasury as it's currently constituted would be?
I think the whole focus of every department, of everybody working in the public sector is does it help growth?
Yeah.
And it actually comes back to healthcare and the preventative point, because if you are good at preventative healthcare, then you keep people off sickness, which means they're in work, which means they're helping growth. So it's all interrelated, but we have to have a total focus on growth. And in a sense, with regard to the KPMG question on tax, look, I can't write anything to 4 years out. What I would say is the best thing that George Osborne did was on corporation tax. He gave a direction of travel. It wasn't a guarantee, it was a direction of travel, 7 or 8 years to get it down from, I think, 28 down to 17, and they did really well. They got to 19, and then they bottled it. Just at the crucial moment when we were heading towards 17, and that was, so as a concept, we understand what the Laffer curve is and how to spell it, and that's a pretty good start. Then, with regard to the question about conceptually water and railways, I just think that, I come back to my joint venture pitch. We've got to be prepared to look at doing things differently. The railways was an absolute, can I use the expression bugger's muddle?
Yes.
Not for printing, but I mean it was, in terms of the mess, and you just had lawyers, sort of saying who's responsible for what and X, Y, Z. So, will the government's current process work? Well, time will tell. They think it will. With regard to water, look, Thames Water's got into a terrible mess because of a failure to be properly regulated, where the regulator allowed it just to gear the backside out of its balance sheet. And it was back to this point about constantly leveraging up, thinking the sun will always shine, and then eventually it didn't. And they've ended up in a really bad place, and we're on the record, it's bust. It's interesting when you share agreement with people like Clive Lewis from the Labour Party on this issue that it's in a right mess and needs to be done differently. So,
do you think there's on the utilities? Do you think there's any issue with the fact that nearly all of them are foreign owned now, and a lot of the value is extracted elsewhere?
Yeah,
and would that be one of the questions about resilience?
I've spoken at length about this. 80%, give or take 80% of our offshore wind farms are overseas owned. Is it right that, the biggest single owner of our UK utilities is a Chinese billionaire? Is that smart? And so when they say they're not paying dividends on the face of the accounts, you know, that's fine, they're not taking that. Until you read page 120 of the accounts and you realise that actually they're taking high interest on their shareholder loans, and that's how they're extracting over £1 billion a year. So there are serious question marks about that with regard to our critical national infrastructure. And it's I think we've got to have that debate, and so we talk about it. We haven't got any prescriptive, definite, but we're the first people that properly talk about this and say, is that really the best way of doing it? And the Tories ideologically just didn't care, and we've ended up in the state we're in. EDF own all of our nuclear facilities, but they've got their own problems in their own country running their own nuclear power stations, etc., etc.
Well, never mind the cost of nuclear in this country. We've probably got time for one more question. Paul, that was a very quick hand up. Go for it.
Paul Baker, Morgan Stanley. The electorate, incredibly disillusioned by politicians not delivering what they say. Something you talked about, the massive crisis in the country's finances. Come the election, not today, but come the election, will you actually be honest on something like triple lock, that it is unfundable and unsustainable, or will you just not give a commitment? Because the latter is what the electorate fudge is what they're used to. Would you actually go out with something bold and radical and honest about triple lock?
Great final question.
It's a great final question. Look, we're going to have to be bold and honest about the state of the finances across the piece, and I just repeat the point. But we'd all love to pay whatever the highest pensions that we can afford. But if you are going bust, and if you're in deep doo-doo, Nigel's touched on it, I've touched on it, you can't guarantee anything when you don't know what the state of the finances will be. It's as simple as that. And in a sense, whether it's a whole bunch of stuff that one spends money on, is the triple lock more important than send, for example? These are all big choices. We have to create a platform of saving wasteful spending in order to be able to work out, right, to create some growth so that we can then fund it. So in a sense, we don't know where the finances will be, but let me tell you, there is no one braver and more honest and focused on stable finances and creating growth than frankly we are.
Brilliant. I do genuinely think that was a great finishing point, not least because to hear, and I will call you a politician, despite that you might not like that, to hear a politician talk about trade-offs in an answer and the fact that there are decisions to be made about where we spend our money and how we spend our money, and actually we can't please everyone and we can't be an ever-expanding state because ultimately that has to be paid for, and at the moment we're not paying for it properly. I think is a brilliant place to end. Look, Richard, thank you so much. That was a fantastic conversation. Again, really great for you giving up your time. I hope we can, have future occasions where we can get into some more of this as your thinking develops. We look forward to hearing what your working groups are coming out with. But any ambition to be ready on day one to actually know what you want to do with, if you are fortunate enough to get into power, has to be applauded. So thank you so much. If we can thank Richard in the usual.